There is one name that above all others stands for greatness in the field of music. When asked to name a famous composer, there is one man that people will name above all others. That one man, that one name, is Ludwig van Beethoven. Beethoven's reputation and success have never wavered. Although there is often controversy in the arts about the contributions of its various masters, there is no controversy over the contributions of Beethoven. In this session, you will come to understand what these contributions were and why he is consistently held in high esteem. You will also get a personal glimpse into Beethoven the man, and you'll have the chance to hear some of the music that captures his truest essence, the genius and inspiration that is still unmatched today. Like many great artists, Beethoven's work marked a transition from one popular form to another. In this case, it was the transition from classical composition to romantic composition. Beethoven's work, especially his early work, brought classical music to perfection. At the same time, it introduced the Romantic era of music and opened the way for many composers that would follow. It could be said that Beethoven was a man who took the past and present to its culmination, and then initiated the future. Later, we will describe more fully the difference between classical and romantic compositions. But for now, it is important to understand that Beethoven was a bridge between both forms, and he excelled in each. He was the predominant musical figure during this important transition, and remains universally regarded as the greatest composer in history. All the composers who followed Beethoven owe him a certain debt. He won for them a new freedom to express themselves, and the opportunity to bring music to new audiences. Before Beethoven's time, composers wrote chiefly for three purposes: for religious services, to teach students, and to entertain people at social functions, often small functions for the upper class. Beethoven's music was different. It was music to be listened to for its own sake. It did not require a church service, a classroom, a tea party, or a stage. It was music that was valued simply because it was music. Today, this doesn't seem like an exceptional accomplishment. Contemporary people listen to music for the sake of music all the time, on the radio, on the stereo, or cassette players, on CDs. But in Beethoven's time, it was different, and not simply because these technologies hadn't been invented. It was different because music required a function or an event to justify it. Music required an external purpose. Beethoven changed this. His music was an event in and of itself. Beethoven's music was an event because he created an entirely new sound. He expanded and changed traditional musical forms so that music had more force, more strength. At first, this confused the critics. They found his music difficult to understand, and so did the musicians. Often they proclaimed Beethoven's work impossible to perform, and more than once a musician stomped out of rehearsal, frustrated by the new and intricate use of their instruments that his work demanded. However, even in his own lifetime, the power of his music became widely recognized and deeply admired. Beethoven was also the first composer to realize the full potential of instrumental music. His were the first compositions that didn't rely heavily on vocals and librettos. A libretto is the verbal text of a composition, such as the dialogue in an opera. Before Beethoven, vocal music was considered the highest art form, and instrumental music was considered inferior. Only music with words, such as cantatas, operas, and oratorios, were held in high regard. Furthermore, music itself was held to be an inferior art form to literature and painting. All of this was beginning to change when Beethoven was writing. It changed in part because of new orchestras with superb abilities. It changed in part because of the work of the composers Haydn and Mozart, who began to imbue music with more feeling. But it changed most of all because of Beethoven himself. He elevated music. He made it far more than just a combination of pleasing or interesting sounds. He wrote music that didn't rely in the least on voices or singing, and he instilled that music with thundering force and intensity and perfection of design. Wagner, who followed Beethoven and took much of his inspiration from him, said Beethoven was the discoverer of instrumental melody. Some of Beethoven's work had an immediate impact on other composers. In many ways, he defined the work of the new generation, influencing such future masters as Berlioz, Schubert, Mendelssohn, Wagner, Brahms, and Mahler. Other works had more impact in the long term, but for almost 200 years, Beethoven's music has never lost its place as a popular and central part of classical music and concert programs. Ludwig van Beethoven was born on December 16, 1770, in the town of Bonn, Germany. It was exactly the right time and the right place for a child of Beethoven's potential. At the time, Bonn was under the guidance of Maximilian Francis, brother to Joseph II, sole ruler of the Holy Roman Empire. Maximilian transformed Bonn from a small provincial town to a thriving center of culture. A liberal Roman Catholic, he gave Bonn a university and opened the city to the leaders of the German literary Renaissance, people like Goethe and Schiller. Soon this formerly insignificant city was filled with some of the most notable artists and thinkers of the times, and into their midst came the young Beethoven. Music was in Beethoven's genes. His grandfather and his father had both been musicians in the service of German princes, and it was expected from the start that the young Ludwig would follow suit. His family was not disappointed. By the time he was only 5, Beethoven was playing the piano and the violin, and demonstrating a remarkable musical memory. His father Johann had ambitions for his son. He wanted to mold him into a child prodigy like Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart had been. Johann, who was an alcoholic, set out to achieve his dream with almost merciless disregard for his son's happiness. He gave him piano lessons when he was only 4. Ludwig was so small he had to stand on the piano bench to reach the keys. His father rapped his knuckles sharply whenever he made a mistake. He forced Ludwig to practice at the piano for hours at a time. He would often come home late at night drunk and force his son out of bed to practice or to show off his talents to his father's friends. Ludwig would sometimes have to play all night, cold, tired, and hungry, tears rolling down his cheeks as his fingers dutifully tapped the piano keys. By the age of 12, Beethoven showed such talent that he was made an assistant and student to a prominent organist in town. At 13, he was accompanying the opera at the keyboard. At 18, he was playing the viola in the local theater orchestra. As a teenager, Beethoven was sent to Vienna, the musical center of Europe, where all aspiring students hoped to study and where some of the most talented amateur and professional musicians had made their home. In Vienna, he played for and took lessons from Mozart, the former child prodigy his father had so admired. Mozart, only 21 years old himself, said of the teenage Beethoven, "This young man will make a great name for himself. He will give the world something worth listening to." But shortly after he arrived in Vienna, Beethoven's mother died, and he returned home to Bonn. He took over the family responsibilities from his alcoholic father, and became the sole support for his father and his 2 younger brothers, Caspar and Nicholas. During this time he also became the tutor to the children of Madame von Breuning, the widow of the Chancellor. It was a pivotal experience for Beethoven. Madame von Breuning introduced him to many of the wealthy and influential people who would later financially support him. These included local Bonn citizens as well as aristocrats and music lovers visiting from Vienna. In 1792, at the age of 22, Beethoven once again returned to Vienna, this time to study with the famous composer Franz Joseph Haydn. On this visit, he gathered more fans in the aristocracy and with Haydn began to perfect his technical skills. At first, Beethoven was admired as a pianist. His emotional playing of the piano was unlike anything the Viennese had heard before. So powerful was his playing that people in the audience could be seen weeping quietly as they listened. This show of emotion never moved Beethoven. He would laugh at the audience and shout, "You are fools." If people talked while he performed, he would storm out in a huff. And if he took a dislike to the people present, he would refuse to perform at all. But people seldom took offense. They always excused his bad manners on behalf of his genius. Soon the Viennese public would recognize that Beethoven was more than a superb pianist. They would come to value him as a composer as well. Many individuals offered him stipends, and these stipends supported him for the rest of his life. Beethoven is believed to be the first composer to make a decent living without having to rely on a court or a church. In the next few years there would be changes that would define the course of Beethoven's future. The first change was the death of his father shortly after he moved to Vienna. Soon after that, the French revolutionary forces went storming into the Rhineland, occupying Beethoven's hometown of Bonn. All of his ties with Bonn had come to an end. Beethoven moved his 2 younger brothers to Vienna and settled in. He would stay there for the remainder of his life, leaving only for summer holidays in the countryside. The man who would soon become the world's greatest composer was now right where he belonged, in the city of musical genius. Unlike most of the composers before him, except Mozart, Beethoven never held an official position in Vienna. He supported himself by giving concerts, teaching piano, and as his reputation increased, through the sales of his compositions. The Viennese aristocracy loved him. There were 2 princes and 1 archduke who provided him a yearly income from 1809 on, with only one condition: he must remain in Vienna. The Viennese people, too, loved Beethoven and forgave him all his eccentricities. When he planned to debut his Ninth Symphony in Berlin, there was such an uproar from the Viennese public and so much begging and pleading that he eventually canceled his plans and presented the symphony in Vienna instead. His fans rewarded him with a thundering and lengthy ovation. Somewhere around 1800, as the new century was dawning, and people were looking forward with optimism and hope, Ludwig van Beethoven began to confront what would be the greatest tragedy of his life. The man who so loved music and who so brilliantly created it was losing his hearing. Beethoven's deafness was a gradual process. It began with buzzing and humming noises in his ears, noises he noticed even before he was 30 years old. Soon he noticed that voices and sounds were becoming dimmer, but he hoped that it was a temporary, or at least it was stable and would not worsen. Then one day, while walking through the countryside with a friend, that friend said, "The sounds of a far-off flute. Let us stop and listen." Beethoven obediently stopped, but he had heard no flute. Beethoven's first reactions to the loss of his hearing were despair and resignation. But soon this gave way to defiance. In 1802, he wrote a famous letter to his brothers, now known as the Heiligenstadt Testament. In that letter, the composer refused to admit defeat. He launched all-out warfare on the pessimism that had engulfed him. He said he was resolved, in his words, to seize fate by the throat and to continue working no matter what his handicaps. Beethoven emerged from this crisis of faith by producing a series of outstanding works that marked an entirely new period artistically. Within the next few years, Beethoven's deafness became so advanced that he could no longer perform publicly, and he began to communicate with people by writing in little notebooks, now known as his conversation books. Over the years, his hearing would fade more and more until finally, by the age of 50, he was completely deaf. At first, he pounded and pounded on the keys of his pianos, trying to make the music loud enough to reach him, but he only succeeded at shattering the keys and snapping the strings. Eventually, he would chop all the legs off his pianos and place them on the floor where he could feel the vibrations of his music. Beethoven's apartment was a remarkable sight. He would have as many as 3 or 4 pianos at once, most of them broken, stained with spilled ink, covered with messy papers and notes, legless on the wooden floor, next to piles of dirty clothes and plates of old, uneaten food. His constant pounding and his sloppy, distracted ways were a nightmare to his landlords. Beethoven had to move many times, often 2 or 3 times a year. The deafness of Ludwig van Beethoven, although tragic, was also a gift, if not for him, for the world. Because he could not hear, he had to gradually cease playing the piano and performing for the public. And when that happened, he shifted his focus to composing and proceeded to create the stunning symphonies, concertos, and sonatas that have enthralled 2 centuries of listeners. Beethoven's deafness never affected his ability to write music. Some of his most important works were composed during the last 10 years of his life when he was completely deaf. It was his destiny to create sounds of exquisite beauty for the whole world to enjoy, but which he himself could never enjoy. Yet although his deafness never interfered with his work, it did affect his personality. He had always been a proud man, independent, and undeniably eccentric. But with the loss of his hearing, he seemed to lose whatever small social graces he once had. He was irritable, rude, often insulting. He once wrote a song for an overweight violinist, entitled it "Praise to the Fat One." And once when he became angry at a prince, who was one of his financial backers, he yelled, "There are and there will be thousands of princes. There is only one Beethoven." His anger and grief at what he'd lost was directed at almost everyone he encountered. He himself explained his behavior in the Heiligenstadt Testament, the same letter to his brothers where he announced he would seize fate by the throat. "O ye men who think or say that I am malevolent, stubborn, or misanthropic, how greatly do you wrong me! You do not know the cause of my seeming so. From childhood my heart and mind was disposed to the gentle feeling of goodwill. I was ever eager to accomplish great deeds, but reflect now that for 6 years I have been a hopeless case, made worse by ignorant doctors, yearly betrayed in the hope of getting better, finally forced to face the prospect of a permanent malady whose cure will take years or even prove impossible. If only I were rid of my affliction, I would embrace the whole world." Beethoven considered suicide for a time, but discarded the thought. He said it was the music that prevented him, but only art held back. For it seemed unthinkable for me to leave the world forever before I had produced all that I felt called upon to produce. Beethoven always felt divine hands at work in his music. When he composed, he considered himself at one with the Creator, and he therefore took endless pains to perfect what he'd written. Once when a violinist complained that his passages were too difficult to be played, Beethoven responded, "When I was composing that, I was conscious of being inspired by God Almighty. Do you think I can consider your puny little fiddle when He speaks to me?" When someone once commented on the long hours he spent by himself, he told them simply, "I am never alone when I am alone." Beethoven often devised his music while taking solitary walks through the town or countryside, humming and muttering to himself, jotting down notes on scraps of paper. Goethe, the famous writer Beethoven admired, said of him, "He is an utterly untamed personality, who is not altogether wrong in holding the world to be detestable, but surely does not make it any more enjoyable either for himself or for others by his attitude." In appearance, Beethoven was the classic distracted genius. His hair grew long and wild. He never bothered to wear clean or new clothes. He was short, with a large head, a face scarred with smallpox, and sad, nearsighted eyes. In later years, his ears were usually stuffed with cotton wool. He had always found himself ugly, and once said, "I cannot love what is not beautiful, or I should be loving myself." Beethoven, probably because of his deafness, had a loud voice and a loud laugh. He was notorious for his odd eating habits. His favorite food was macaroni and cheese, but he also liked red herrings, a bread and egg soup, and strong coffee that have to have exactly 60 beans to the cup. He would often take a large pitcher of water and dump it over his head, not to clean himself, but to keep himself awake. It is difficult to imagine anyone living with Beethoven, yet it was a lifelong dream of the composer to marry and have children. He fell in love often. In fact, it's been said he was always in love with someone, but no woman could see herself in the difficult role of Mrs. Beethoven. His proposals were always rejected. In 1812, Beethoven wrote a series of letters to a woman he addressed only as his immortal beloved. Although no one knows for sure, it is believed that his beloved was the wife of a friend named Antony Brentano. Whoever she was, she clearly was the most important love relationship the composer ever had, and the end of that relationship was so traumatic to Beethoven that he entered a lengthy period of seclusion and depression, during which he wrote very little. The next crisis in Beethoven's life came in 1815, when his brother Caspar died, and he launched a custody battle for Caspar's son, Karl, who was then 9 years old. In Karl, Beethoven saw the chance for the family that had always eluded him. For 5 years he fought in the courts to become Karl's guardian, and finally his wish was granted. The relationship didn't go well. Beethoven had neither the time nor patience to be a father figure, and Karl rebelled. His rebellion caused the possessive Beethoven much grief. The tense emotions between them reached a climax in 1826, when Karl, now 21 years old, attempted suicide. Overcome with despair, Beethoven became ill and lacked the strength to overcome it. He caught a cold which developed into pneumonia and then dropsy. He finally died on March 26, 1827, at the age of 57. Legend has it that right before he died, he roused himself from his bed in the middle of a thunderstorm and shook his fist at the sky. All Vienna went into mourning when Beethoven died. The citizens stood on their doorsteps and watched, crying, as his coffin passed by. The crowds outside the church where the memorial service was held were so dense that it took an hour and a half just to walk 1 block. 1 out of every 10 citizens came to pay their respects. 20,000 people attended his funeral. Among his pallbearers was the famous pianist Hummel. Among his torchbearers was the composer Franz Schubert. Austria's greatest living dramatist, Franz Grillparzer, wrote the eulogy, and Mozart's Requiem was played. Whatever his peculiarities, the people had adored him. They considered his music a great gift and a great treasure. In his last public appearance, the audience had roared its applause and approval, but the deaf Beethoven had been oblivious. Finally, someone tugged on his sleeve and turned him around so he could see the crowd. It was one of the few times he was ever seen crying. The music that so moved the people of Beethoven's time, and which continues to move us today, was written over a period of about 40 years, and includes symphonies, concertos, sonatas, masses, and 1 opera. A sonata is a musical composition for a few selected instruments. A concerto is a composition for a solo instrument or instruments accompanied by an orchestra. A symphony is a composition for a full orchestra. In his time, Beethoven composed 9 symphonies, 5 piano concertos, a violin concerto, 32 piano sonatas, several other sonatas, 2 masses, and 1 opera. Of all these pieces, perhaps his most well-known are the 5th Symphony and the 9th Symphony. The first 4 notes of the 5th Symphony, 3 short beats followed by 1 long beat, may be the most famous notes of all time. first famous notes of this piece have been sometimes interpreted as the sound of fate knocking on one's door. Beethoven's other most popular symphony, the Ninth, has several sections that are familiar to almost everyone, but perhaps the most popular is the last movement, chorale music set to Schiller's poem, Ode to Joy. This part of the Ninth Symphony is so inspiring to people that it's often played at special occasions or historic events. For instance, it was played during the Chinese student protest in 1989, and it was also played when Germany's Berlin Wall was torn down in 1990. Yet these two selections are only a small part of the vast amount of powerful and beautiful music Beethoven produced. That music is generally divided into three periods. The first or early period covers his early works up until about 1800, when he turned 30 years old. During this period, Beethoven followed the traditions of 18th century music. These first works were heavily influenced by two great composers who preceded him, but who were also his contemporaries, Wolfgang Mozart and Joseph Haydn. Beethoven mastered the high classical style during this period and the use of counterpoint. Counterpoint is the technique of composing two or more melodies that are heard simultaneously. This concern with craftsmanship was typical of the 18th century classical approach. Beethoven wrote mostly for piano in these years. He wrote his first two symphonies, his first three piano concertos, and several sonatas, including the Pathétique. From about 1802 on, Beethoven entered his second or middle period, when he produced music that is often described as dramatic and heroic. It was his most productive period, and it was during these years that he began to break with formal conventions of classical music. He wrote his third through eighth symphonies, his one violin concerto, and his only opera. The third symphony is called Eroica, but that wasn't its original name. Originally, Beethoven named it Bonaparte, and intended it as a tribute to the hero of revolutionary France, who was the exact same age as Beethoven himself. But when Napoleon proclaimed himself an emperor, Beethoven became disenchanted, and in anger tore the title page of his symphony in two. He renamed it Eroica, which means heroic, and wrote that it had been composed in his words to celebrate the memory of a great man. The one opera he wrote was called Fidelio. Beethoven seemed cautious about opera, perhaps because he never felt completely comfortable composing for voice. He revised it twice and wrote 4 overtures before he was satisfied. Fidelio was an opera that praised the ideals of freedom, individuality, and triumph over tyranny, ideals Beethoven had admired in the French Revolution. Beethoven wrote one of his most moving and haunting sonatas during this middle period and dedicated it to an 18-year-old countess with whom he was in love at the time. He called it Sonata in C-sharp minor, or more poetically, the Moonlight Sonata. This middle period of Beethoven's work was a period in which he began to explore, and it's the period that would influence the Romantic composers that followed. His harmonies remained simple, but he began to use them in new ways, relating them differently to the main pulse of the music. He paved the way with compositions that were highly expressive, mysterious, and lyrical. A key characteristic of Romantic music was that it suggested meanings without making them specific. There is a sense of hidden significance. People liked to come up with stories and themes that would explain the meaning of Beethoven's work, and he often encouraged them by choosing descriptive titles such as Pastoral, his own name for the Sixth Symphony. Beethoven's third and final period, called the Late Period, began about 1816 and culminated with his final work, the monumental Ninth Symphony. This was a period in which his work took on greater depth in spite of the fact, or perhaps because of the fact, that through much of it he was entirely or almost entirely deaf. His work became less dramatic and more introspective. He relied less and less on the traditional classical format. That format used 3 or 4 movements, and the first movement was usually the most dramatic. It also relied on a large-scale structure rather than on local, smaller themes. Instead, Beethoven began to explore the use of 2 to 7 movements of widely different character and style, playing off each other. As he became more isolated in these years, his music became more personal and more expressive. The range and expression and mood of these third-period pieces has never been surpassed. His work during these years was so innovative it wasn't fully understood until later. He had included complicated musical structures and fugues, short themes that are repeated by different instruments. These works stretched the abilities of the musicians and their instruments and confused people of the time. But it was this period that would influence composers of the 1900s, including Bela Bartok. The contribution Beethoven made to classical composition was that he created works of art with varied emotions and yet with unity that relied on the organization of the music itself. His contribution to Romantic composition was that he used the power of his music to convey a philosophy of life without the need of a spoken text. When he described his Sixth Symphony, the Pastoral, as more an expression of emotion than painting, he was laying the groundwork for the Romantics who would follow. To Beethoven, feeling was important in the music, yet this didn't make him a true Romantic. He is instead a true classical composer, chiefly because of the balance he achieved with emotion and form. This balance created a distinctive Beethoven sound, the crescendos leading to a sudden piano, the unexpected accents, the rapid up and down of chords. All these were his trademarks, and are what helped him give the instrumental its own life and value, free from reliance on vocals and song. Beethoven's sketchbooks, many of which still remain, give us an idea of how painstakingly he worked. He designed his compositions with great care, revising and altering as new ideas came to him. Some sketches start with just a melody and a bass, but in others the sketches are fully developed and elaborate. He seemed to work on more than one composition at a time, and never seemed rushed about finishing. It was a process that often took many years. Beethoven took his mission seriously. Unlike most composers of his time, he clearly believed he was creating high art, and that this art had the potential for immortality. The greatness of Ludwig van Beethoven lies in the extraordinary music he created, and it lies also in his personal approach to his art and to his life. He was an artist who dared to break with tradition, to remain true to his own inner vision. Unlike composers before him, he refused to be limited by what could be sung. In fact, he refused to be limited at all. Even though he could and did master conventional classical form, he insisted on going further, inventing a new form that offered greater range of emotion and power. In doing so, he freed music for many composers who followed, and opened the doors for the romantic period of music that took its inspiration chiefly from him. He is also almost solely responsible for giving instrumental music its rightful place in history, as an art form in and of itself, independent of the voice and singing. He personally demonstrated his own love and respect for music by dedicating his life to it, at high personal cost. His music deprived him of any hope of a conventional domestic life or family. He pursued his art with such dedication that even complete deafness could not stop him. With determination and strength of will, he overcame what to most people would be an insurmountable obstacle, and as soon as he resolved to do so, he began to produce his most extraordinary work. To Ludwig van Beethoven, music was divine, work was divine, and his gift he always viewed as a gift from God. He took the gift seriously, he worked diligently, insisted on perfection, and refused to be daunted by physical handicaps or by people who didn't understand his work. All of this he did to fulfill the promise of this divinely given gift. In exchange, he has been given immortality, and he remains to this day the greatest composer who ever lived.